The cold wind swept through Bryant Park, rustling the last remnants of autumn leaves. Jack Lawson pulled his coat tighter around himself, the exhaustion of a long shift at the hospital weighing on his shoulders. As a renowned neurosurgeon, he was used to working under pressure, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the looming darkness, or perhaps the quiet that had settled over the usually bustling park, but an inexplicable feeling tugged at him. He was just about to pass by the park's central fountain when he noticed a small figure sitting on a bench, huddled under a thin coat. At first, he assumed it was just another person seeking solace from the cold, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a child. A girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She sat perfectly still, staring at the ground as if the world around her didn't exist. Jack hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who usually stopped for strangers, especially children, but something about her solitude felt wrong. He approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Hey," he said softly, lowering himself to her eye level. "Are you okay?" The girl slowly looked up, her eyes wide and distant. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and strands of her dark hair stuck to her tear-streaked face. She didn't respond, just blinked at him as though she hadn't heard the question. Jack frowned, his medical instincts kicking in. "Where's your family? Are you lost?" I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His heart sank. She didn't know where her family was. In fact, it became quickly evident that she didn't seem to know much of anything at all. Her gaze drifted past him, vacant, as if she was trying to grasp onto a memory that wouldn't come. Jack's concern deepened. "Do you know your name?" he asked gently. She shook her head. I don't remember." Panic began to creep into Jack's mind. A child, alone in a city as massive as New York, without a name or an idea of where she belonged. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But there was something more, something unsettling in her expression that made him feel this was more than just a case of a lost child. He knelt in front of her, doing his best to make her feel safe. "Okay," he said slowly. "It's going to be all right. We'll figure this out. Do you live nearby? Maybe we can find your home?" The girl looked at him again, her brow furrowing as though she was trying to remember. "I don't know. I was with someone, I think, but then they were gone." Jack's mind raced. He couldn't just leave her here. He didn't even know where to start looking for her family, but leaving her alone in the park wasn't an option. He glanced at his phone, briefly considering calling the authorities. But something about that felt impersonal, wrong even. This child needed more than a quick handoff to strangers in uniform. "Okay," he said, making a decision. "Why don't you come with me? We'll figure this out together." The girl hesitated, her small hands clutching the fabric of her coat tightly. She looked scared, lost. Jack offered her a reassuring smile, standing and extending his hand. "I promise, I'm here to help." After what felt like an eternity, she reached up and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were icy cold. Jack gently wrapped his hand around hers, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. As they walked together out of the park, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was doing. This wasn't part of his plan. He wasn't supposed to be wandering the streets of Manhattan with a lost child. Yet, here he was, with no clear idea of what came next. The city buzzed around them, people going about their business, unaware of the small tragedy unfolding in Jack's world. He led her down the busy streets, his mind racing with thoughts of how to solve this puzzle. She stayed quiet, her hand gripping his like a lifeline. Jack was about to suggest they stop at a nearby cafe to warm up when she tugged at his sleeve. I think I remember something," she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Jack stopped in his tracks. "What is it?" The girl pointed down a narrow street. "I've been there before. I think my home is that way." For a moment, Jack felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they were close to finding her family after all. He glanced at the street she indicated, a row of old, worn-down buildings. It didn't seem like the kind of place where a child should live, but he had to trust her instinct. "All right," he said, nodding. "Let's check it out." They made their way down the narrow street, Jack feeling the tension in the air rise with every step. The buildings were decrepit, the windows barred, and the faint sound of city noise seemed to fade into an eerie quiet. Jack glanced at the girl, who was now looking more nervous than ever. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, run-down apartment building. The girl looked up at the door, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said quietly. "I live here." Jack felt his stomach twist. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain it, but an unease settled over him as they stood before the building. He wasn't sure if it was the look of the place or the lingering silence, but every instinct told him this wasn't going to be a simple reunion. But he had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Jack reached for the door, his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed it open. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. Jack stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The girl clung to his hand, her small fingers trembling. The uneasy feeling in Jack's chest only grew stronger as they moved down the narrow corridor. "This way," she whispered, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. Jack nodded, guiding her forward. His mind raced. Who would they find behind that door? The girl's parents? A guardian? The growing dread that had settled in his stomach made him wonder if he was about to walk into a situation far more complicated than he had anticipated. They stopped in front of the worn wooden door. Jack hesitated for a moment before knocking gently. The sound echoed through the empty hall, and for a long stretch of time, there was only silence. Jack glanced down at the girl, whose wide eyes were fixed on the door as if she feared what lay on the other side. Finally, there was a noise, a faint shuffling from inside. Jack straightened as the door slowly opened a crack, revealing a shadowed figure behind it. A woman. She was thin, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Something about her looked familiar, like a distant memory from a life he had long since buried. Then, like a punch to the gut, the realization hit him. "Margaret?" Jack's voice came out in a stunned whisper, barely audible. The woman blinked, her tired eyes meeting his. She froze, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if she were trying to steady herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of recognition heavy between them. "Jack?" Her voice was weak, hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. Jack felt his heart race. It couldn't be. Margaret, his ex-fiancée, the woman he had loved and left behind all those years ago. He had abandoned her for his career, walked away from the life they had planned together, convinced that the sacrifices were necessary to become the man he was today. But now, standing before her, everything came rushing back, the guilt, the unresolved emotions, and the questions he had never dared ask himself. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice wavering. She glanced down at the little girl, who had inched closer to Jack, as if seeking protection. I found her in the park," Jack stammered, struggling to find the right words. She couldn't remember anything, not her name, not where she lived. She said she thought she lived here. I didn't know." Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at the girl. "Come inside," she whispered, pushing the door open wider. Jack stepped inside, the room dimly lit by a single lamp on a small table. The air was heavy with the scent of stale cigarettes and illness. Margaret moved slowly, her frail body a shadow of the woman he once knew. Jack's mind was racing, trying to process everything. I don't understand," he finally said, his voice tight. "Margaret, what happened?" Margaret sank into a worn-out armchair, coughing lightly into her hand. "Life happened, Jack," she replied, her tone flat, devoid of the energy he remembered. "You left. I tried to move on, but things didn't go as planned." Jack swallowed hard, his guilt overwhelming him. "And the girl? She's your daughter?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Her name is Emily." Emily. The name felt like a shock to Jack's system, something he should have known, but didn't. He looked down at the little girl, who was now standing quietly beside him, her expression guarded. How could he have not seen it? The dark hair, the shape of her eyes, they were Margaret's. And now that he was looking more closely, he could see the faint resemblance to himself as well. Jack felt his world tilt. Emily, his daughter. How? He couldn't finish the question. His mind was reeling with the implications. How had this happened? How had he gone so many years without knowing? His chest tightened as the realization sank in deeper. "I didn't know how to find you," Margaret said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "And honestly, I didn't want to. You had your life, your career. I didn't want to be the reason you gave it all up." Jack knelt beside her, the weight of his actions crushing him. "Margaret, I didn't mean for it to be like this. I didn't know." She gave him a sad smile. "I know, Jack, but that doesn't change anything, does it?" The silence stretched between them, thick with regret and unspoken words. Jack's eyes flickered to Emily, who stood quietly, watching them both with wide, curious eyes. The weight of fatherhood, of responsibility, settled onto Jack's shoulders with crushing force. Margaret's cough broke the silence, harsh and wet. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he moved to her side, his medical training taking over. "You're not well," he said, his voice filled with concern. "How long have you been like this?" Margaret shook her head. "It's nothing. Just life catching up to me." But Jack wasn't convinced. He could see the signs, the pallor of her skin, the labored breathing, the weight loss. Something was seriously wrong, and he couldn't just walk away from this. "I'm taking you to the hospital," he said firmly. "No," she protested weakly. "I can't leave Emily here alone." "She won't be alone," Jack said, glancing at the girl. "We'll figure it out. But you need help, Margaret." Margaret hesitated, her eyes flickering between Jack and her daughter. Finally, she nodded, too weak to argue. Jack gently helped her to her feet, feeling the frailty of her body under his touch. How had things come to this? How had the vibrant woman he once loved become so fragile, so broken? As they left the apartment, Jack couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had settled over him. He had walked away from Margaret once, and now, it felt as though fate had brought him back, giving him a second chance, whether he was ready for it or not. The weight of the past bore down on him as they stepped out into the cold night air, Emily's small hand clutching his. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the sterile white walls as Jack guided Margaret into the emergency room. Emily's small hand clung to his, and the weight of the situation settled more heavily on his shoulders with each passing second. His mind raced, torn between the immediate need to get Margaret the care she desperately needed and the avalanche of emotions tied to seeing her again, to discovering that he had a daughter he never knew existed. A nurse rushed over with a wheelchair, and Jack carefully helped Margaret into it. She was barely holding herself together, her body frail, her breathing shallow. Jack had seen enough patients over the years to know that whatever was happening to her wasn't something simple. It was serious, and time was running out. "Get her into a room," Jack ordered, his professional tone returning as his instincts took over. "We need to run a full workup, blood tests, scans, everything." The nurse glanced at him, recognizing the authority in his voice, and nodded. "Right away, Dr. Lawson." As they wheeled Margaret away, Jack felt a tug on his hand. Emily was looking up at him with wide, scared eyes, her face pale with worry. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Jack knelt down to her level, the weight of fatherhood pressing on him harder than ever before. "I'm going to do everything I can to help her," he promised, though he couldn't shake the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his mind. He didn't know the full extent of Margaret's condition, but the signs were ominous. Emily nodded, though she didn't look reassured. Jack stood, his mind whirling. He needed to focus, to get control of the situation. He led Emily to a small waiting area just outside the emergency room, and they sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the hospital filling the space between them. Jack's thoughts spiraled. How had this happened? How had Margaret ended up in such dire straits, and why hadn't she reached out to him sooner? More importantly, how had he gone so long without knowing about Emily? The questions circled endlessly in his mind, each one heavier than the last. He looked over at Emily, her small frame hunched over in the chair, and felt a pang of guilt. He had missed so much, years of her life, moments he could never get back. The realization was overwhelming, and for the first time, he felt truly helpless. The door to the emergency room opened, and a doctor emerged, his expression grave. Jack stood quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dr. Lawson," the doctor said, nodding in recognition. "We've got Margaret stabilized for now, but her condition is critical. We're still running tests, but from what I can see, her organs are shutting down. We need to move fast if we're going to save her." Jack's stomach tightened. "What's causing it?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a random illness. The doctor shook his head. "It's hard to say. There's something unusual about her condition. Her immune system is attacking her body like it's been compromised. We're going to run more tests to figure out what's going on, but whatever this is, it's progressing quickly." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He needed answers, now. "Keep me updated," he said, his tone firm. "I'll be in my office looking over her records. I need to figure out what's going on." The doctor nodded and disappeared back through the door. Jack turned to Emily, who was watching him with wide, worried eyes. She had been so quiet, so calm through all of this, but Jack could see the fear lurking beneath the surface. "Can I see her?" Emily asked softly. Jack hesitated. Margaret was in no condition for visitors, but he couldn't bear to deny his daughter this small comfort. "Not yet," he said gently, crouching down beside her. "She needs to rest for a little while, but as soon as she's ready, I'll take you to see her. I promise." Emily nodded, though tears were beginning to well up in her eyes. Jack reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's going to be okay. We'll figure this out together." For the first time, Emily leaned into him, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she buried her face in his shoulder. Jack felt his heart clench. He had missed out on so much, but in this moment, as he held his daughter, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, of belonging. But there was no time to dwell on that now. He had a job to do. "I need to go check on some things," Jack said, gently pulling away. "I'll be back soon, okay? I won't leave you." Emily nodded again, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Jack gave her a reassuring smile before heading down the hallway toward his office. As he walked, his mind raced with possibilities. The symptoms Margaret was exhibiting were unusual, almost as if her body was reacting to something foreign. The idea gnawed at him, a theory slowly forming in the back of his mind. Could this be connected to something from their past? Something they had both forgotten or overlooked? Jack reached his office, flipping on the lights as he made his way to his desk. He pulled up Margaret's medical records, scanning through her recent history. There wasn't much to go on, but something caught his attention, a reference to a clinical trial she had participated in a few years ago. Jack's stomach dropped. He had heard whispers about the trial, an experimental drug meant to boost immune response, but there had been rumors of complications, of patients who had suffered severe side effects. Suddenly, it all made sense. Margaret's condition wasn't just a random illness. It was the result of that drug trial, one that Jack had unknowingly been involved in as part of his research team. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He had played a part in this, even if he hadn't known it at the time. The guilt washed over him in waves. Margaret's suffering, her deteriorating health, it was all connected to choices he had made, to a career path that had led him away from her and into a world of ethical compromises. Jack sank into his chair, his mind spinning. How could he fix this? How could he make things right when the very thing that was killing her was a result of his own ambition? He couldn't change the past, but he could do everything in his power to save her now. He had to. Pushing the guilt aside, Jack stood and hurried back toward the emergency room, a renewed sense of determination driving him forward. He would find a way to save Margaret, no matter the cost. But as he reached the doors of the ER, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jack pulled it out, glancing at the screen. An unknown number. He answered it, his voice tight with tension. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold, calculated. "Dr. Lawson, I think it's time we talked about your role in all of this." The line went dead, leaving Jack standing there, his heart pounding with dread. The call ended abruptly, the hollow sound of the disconnected line reverberating in Jack's ears. He stared at his phone, his heart racing, confusion and dread mingling in his chest. The voice had been unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking the threat behind the words. Someone knew about the clinical trial, knew about his involvement, and more disturbingly, knew enough to make this personal. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was no coincidence. Margaret's illness, the trial, the call, it was all connected, and now someone was watching him, pulling strings behind the scenes. But why? And, more importantly, who? His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of the hospital's PA system, calling his name. Dr. Lawson, report to the emergency department. Dr. Lawson, to the emergency department. The urgency in the voice cut through his clouded mind, snapping him back to the present. He shoved his phone into his pocket and hurried down the hallway, his steps quickening as the weight of the unknown pressed down on him. Margaret's condition had been critical when he left her, and the mysterious phone call only amplified his fears. When he reached the emergency department, the scene was chaotic. Nurses and doctors rushed back and forth, and in the center of it all, Margaret lay on a stretcher, her body convulsing. The monitors beeped frantically, her vitals plummeting. "Code blue! Get the crash cart!" someone shouted. Jack pushed his way through the crowd, his heart in his throat. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fear. "She's coding," the attending physician responded, his face tense with concentration. "Her heart's failing. We need to get her stabilized." Jack's mind raced. This was worse than he had anticipated. Margaret was slipping away, and the cause of her rapid deterioration was still a mystery. He could feel the seconds ticking away, precious time that they couldn't afford to lose. "I need epinephrine," Jack ordered, his tone commanding, "and get the defibrillator ready. We're not losing her." A nurse handed him the syringe, and Jack injected it into Margaret's fore, praying it would be enough to shock her heart back into rhythm. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone held their breath, waiting for the monitors to respond. Seconds passed, each one agonizingly slow. Finally, the beeping leveled out. Her heart rate stabilized, barely, but it was enough to buy them more time. Jack exhaled, relief washing over him, but it was short-lived. Margaret was still dangerously close to the edge, and the cause of her illness remained elusive. "We need more answers," Jack muttered under his breath, his mind already racing through possibilities. He turned to the attending physician. "Run a tox screen. I want a full metabolic panel and a scan of her organs. Something's attacking her from the inside, and I need to know what it is." The doctor nodded, and the team sprang into action, rushing to carry out Jack's orders. He stepped back, his hands trembling slightly, adrenaline still coursing through him. He had saved her, for now, but it wasn't enough. Whatever was killing Margaret, it was progressing too fast. If they didn't identify the source soon, she wouldn't survive the night. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling up inside him. Every instinct told him this wasn't just a natural illness. It was something far more sinister, something connected to the clinical trial she had been a part of, and by extension, to him. His thoughts were interrupted when Emily appeared at the doorway, her small figure framed by the harsh fluorescent light. She looked terrified, her wide eyes darting between Jack and the chaos surrounding Margaret. Jack walked over to her, crouching down to her level. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your mom's fighting really hard right now. We're doing everything we can to help her, okay?" Emily nodded, but Jack could see the fear etched into her face. "Is she going to die?" she whispered, her voice small and fragile. The question hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He didn't know how to answer. He wanted to promise her that everything would be all right, that her mother would pull through. But the truth was, he didn't know if that was possible. And the weight of that uncertainty crushed him. "I'm going to do everything I can," he said instead, his voice tight. "I promise you that." Emily bit her lip, clearly fighting back tears. Jack reached out, gently pulling her into a hug. For a moment, they stayed like that, the noise of the hospital fading into the background as Jack held his daughter. The realization of their bond, so new and yet so profound, sent a wave of emotions crashing over him. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Jack needed answers. He needed to find out what was killing Margaret and who was behind the cryptic phone call. As he stood, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His pulse quickened as he answered. "Dr. Lawson." The voice on the other end began, the same cold, calculating tone as before. I see you're still trying to play the hero. How quaint. Jack's jaw tightened. Who is this? I'm someone who knows exactly what you did, the voice replied smoothly. And if you want to keep your precious career intact, you'll stop digging into Margaret's condition. Jack's blood ran cold. You know what's happening to her, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You're involved in this. A soft chuckle echoed through the phone. Involved is a strong word. Let's just say I'm aware of certain developments. Jack's grip tightened around the phone. If you think you can threaten me into staying quiet, you're wrong. I'll find out what's going on, and I'll expose whoever is behind this. I don't think you understand the situation, Dr. Lawson, the voice continued, unfazed. You're in far deeper than you realize. Margaret's condition is a direct result of the trial you were a part of. If you dig too deep, you'll find yourself implicated in ways you won't be able to talk your way out of. Careers have been ruined for less. The words hit Jack like a punch. This wasn't just about Margaret's illness. It was about his own involvement in the research that had led to it. His past decisions, the ones he had buried under years of professional success, were coming back to haunt him in the worst possible way. You don't scare me, Jack said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. The voice on the other end chuckled again. Perhaps not yet, but you will. Stay out of this, Dr. Lawson, if you know what's good for you. The line went dead once more, leaving Jack standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Margaret's illness wasn't just a random medical anomaly. It was the result of the clinical trial, an experiment that had gone horribly wrong, and Jack, unknowingly, had played a part in it. Now, whoever was behind the trial was trying to cover their tracks, and Jack was standing in their way. He couldn't let this go. Not now. Not when Margaret's life was hanging in the balance, and not when his daughter was depending on him. Jack slipped his phone into his pocket and turned back toward the emergency room, a renewed sense of determination burning in his chest. He was going to find the truth, no matter the cost. And this time, he wasn't walking away. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Jack felt the weight of the phone call hanging over him as he stepped back into the emergency room. The words of the mysterious caller echoed in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Whoever they were, they had power. Enough to be involved in Margaret's condition, enough to threaten his career and everything he had worked for. But more than that, they had knowledge. Knowledge that could save Margaret's life. He wasn't afraid of losing his reputation. He was afraid of losing her. Margaret lay in the hospital bed, her chest rising and falling shallowly as machines beeped in rhythm with her fading heartbeat. Jack stood at the foot of her bed, watching helplessly as the life slowly drained from her. She had been a vibrant, fearless woman when they had been together, and now she was a shadow of that person, reduced to this fragile state because of choices made in the past. Choices he was only beginning to understand. He felt a presence next to him and looked down to see Emily standing by his side, her small hand reaching for his. Her wide eyes were fixed on her mother, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She'll be okay, right? Emily asked, her voice small, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly would shatter the thin thread keeping her mother alive. Jack knelt down, looking into his daughter's eyes. He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise her that Margaret would be fine. But the truth was, he didn't know. Not yet. I'm going to do everything I can, Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I promise. Emily nodded, trusting him, even though he wasn't sure he trusted himself anymore. Jack gently squeezed her hand, then stood, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the past few hours. He needed answers, real answers, not just guesses or theories. Margaret's condition was deteriorating too fast for him to waste any more time. He walked over to the attending physician, who was studying the latest test results. What have we found? Jack asked, keeping his voice calm even as his anxiety gnawed at him. The doctor shook his head, frowning as he scanned the reports. It's not good. Her immune system is in overdrive, attacking her organs like they're foreign bodies. The scans show massive inflammation, and her liver and kidneys are beginning to fail. Whatever this is, it's progressing faster than we can treat it. Jack clenched his jaw, frustration boiling inside him. They were running out of time. If they didn't identify the cause soon, Margaret wouldn't survive the night. He knew the clinical trial had something to do with it, but without more information, he couldn't stop whatever was destroying her from the inside out. He turned to leave, his mind already working on what to do next, when the doctor spoke again. "There is something odd, though," the physician said, flipping through the chart. "We found traces of an experimental compound in her blood, a drug I've never seen before. It's not listed in any of the usual databases." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The clinical trial? It had to be. The drug that was supposed to boost the immune system, but instead had wreaked havoc on her body. And he had been part of the team that had developed it, back when he had been consumed by ambition, blind to the potential consequences of the work they were doing. He rushed back to his office, his mind a blur of panic and determination. There had to be records, files from the trial, something that would give him more information about the drug and its effects. If he could figure out exactly what had been used on Margaret, he could find a way to reverse it. The hospital's internal database was his first stop. Jack pulled up every document he could find on the clinical trial Margaret had been a part of, scanning through pages of research reports, patient histories, and test results. The drug, called Zenexa, had been developed to treat autoimmune diseases by supercharging the immune response. But something had gone wrong. The side effects had been catastrophic for a select few patients. Patients like Margaret, whose bodies had responded too aggressively, turning their own immune systems against them. Jack's pulse quickened as he read further. The results had been buried. The trial quietly shut down after a few disastrous outcomes. Most of the patients had survived, but some, like Margaret, had suffered irreversible damage. The pharmaceutical company had covered up the worst cases to protect their reputation, and now, someone was trying to keep Jack from uncovering the truth. But it wasn't just the drug itself that caught Jack's attention. It was the timing. The trial had taken place just a year after he had left Margaret. She had been desperate for help, battling her own health problems, and had signed up for the trial out of sheer necessity. If he had stayed, if he hadn't walked away, he could have protected her from this. He could have been there to stop her from becoming a guinea pig in a dangerous experiment. Jack slammed his fist down on the desk, frustration and guilt surging through him. He had walked away from Margaret once, and now she was paying the price. But he wasn't going to let her die because of his mistakes. Not again. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Dr. Stephen Mitchell, his old mentor, had been the lead on the Zenexa trial. If anyone had the answers Jack needed, it was him. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, smooth and controlled. "Jack, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Jack's blood ran cold. Mitchell's voice carried the same calculated tone as the mysterious caller earlier. "You're involved in this," Jack said, his voice low, filled with a barely contained fury. "You knew about the side effects of Zenexa, and you covered it up." Now, Mitchell replied calmly, "let's not get ahead of ourselves. We were doing important work. You know that. Risks were taken, but the rewards were worth it." "Worth it?" Jack growled. "Margaret is dying because of that drug. This wasn't just a risk, it was a death sentence." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Mitchell was considering his next move. "I'm sorry to hear about Margaret," he said finally, his tone devoid of real sympathy. "But you have to understand, Jack, you were part of this. You signed off on the protocols, you were part of the research. If this comes out, it's not just me who goes down. It's you too." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anger swirling inside him. Mitchell was right. If the truth about Zenexa came out, Jack's name would be dragged through the mud alongside his former mentors. His career would be over. Everything he had worked for would be destroyed. But then he thought of Margaret, lying in that hospital bed, fighting for her life. He thought of Emily, the daughter he had only just found, trusting him to save her mother. None of that mattered anymore. His career, his reputation, none of it was worth the cost of Margaret's life. "I don't care about my career," Jack said, his voice cold and firm. "I'm going to save her, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Mitchell's tone hardened. If you go down this path, Jack, there's no coming back. Think very carefully about your next move." Jack didn't hesitate. "I've already made my choice." He hung up the phone, his mind made up. There was no turning back now. The air outside Jack's office felt thick, as if the weight of his decision had manifested around him. His conversation with Dr. Mitchell had left a lingering bitterness in his mouth. Jack could feel the gravity of what he was about to do, a path with no return. But he had made his choice. There was no hesitation now. He had to save Margaret, and nothing was going to stand in his way. As he made his way back to the emergency room, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Jack's fingers tightened around the device, knowing what was coming. He answered, bracing himself. "I warned you," the voice from earlier said, colder now, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You should have listened." Jack's pulse quickened. "And what? Let Margaret die? I won't stop. Whatever you're trying to hide. It ends now." A low chuckle came through the line, dark and menacing. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about one woman. It's bigger than that. We're not going to let you destroy everything we've built just because of a little guilt." Jack's hand clenched into a fist. "This isn't about guilt. It's about doing the right thing. I've seen what that drug has done to Margaret, and I know she's not the only one. You might have covered up the results, but I'll find a way to expose you." The voice on the other end sighed, almost as if it was disappointed. "You've made your choice, Dr. Lawson, but don't say I didn't warn you. Walk away while you still can." The call cut off abruptly, leaving Jack standing in the hallway, his heart pounding. He slid the phone into his pocket, his mind made up. Whoever was behind this might have power, but they underestimated his resolve. He wasn't going to back down. He rushed back to Margaret's room, where a team of doctors and nurses were still working tirelessly to stabilize her. The sight of her, lying so still, her body barely hanging on, sent a fresh surge of determination through him. He wasn't just fighting to save her life. He was fighting to make up for the years he had lost, for the pain he had caused by walking away. The attending physician approached him, his expression grim. "Dr. Lawson, we're losing her. Her liver is failing, and her body isn't responding to the treatments. If we don't figure out what's causing this soon..." Jack didn't let him finish. "It's the drug from the clinical trial she was part of, Zenexa," he said urgently. "It's attacking her immune system. I need you to help me find an immunosuppressant that can counteract it." The doctor frowned, clearly taken aback by Jack's sudden revelation. "Zenexa? That drug was taken off the market years ago. You're saying she was part of that trial?" Jack nodded, his mind racing. "Yes, I was involved in the research. There were cases where patients had severe autoimmune reactions, just like Margaret. We need to suppress her immune system immediately, or she won't make it." The doctor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll get the team to administer high-dose immunosuppressants right away." "But Jack," he paused, his expression grave. "If this doesn't work, there may be nothing more we can do." Jack swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a blow. "I understand. Just do it." The doctor hurried off to give the orders, and Jack moved to Margaret's bedside, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out and gently took her hand. Her skin was cold, her face pale and drawn, but there was still a flicker of life in her, and that was all he needed to hold on to. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let this happen." The machines beeped steadily beside her, a reminder of the fragility of the moment. Jack leaned in closer, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not after everything. He had walked away from her once, but he wasn't going to make that mistake again. This time, he would fight. As he stood there, the door to the room opened, and Jack turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her small face filled with worry. She had been so brave through all of this, but Jack could see the fear etched into her features, the uncertainty of what might happen to her mother. He motioned for her to come closer, and she slowly walked to his side, her eyes never leaving Margaret. "Is she going to wake up?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm for her sake. "The doctors are doing everything they can. We just have to be strong for her, okay?" Emily nodded, though the tears were starting to gather in her eyes. Jack reached out and pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her close as they stood together by Margaret's bedside. It was in that moment, as he felt the weight of his daughter's small body against him, that Jack fully understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about Margaret. It was about Emily, about the family they could have had, the family they still might have if he could save her. As the minutes ticked by, the nurses moved swiftly around the room, administering the immunosuppressants in the hope of slowing down the destruction happening inside Margaret's body. Jack watched anxiously, every second stretching out painfully, each beat of the heart monitor a reminder of how close they were to losing her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the nurses turned to Jack, her expression cautiously hopeful. "Her vitals are stabilizing," she said quietly. "The immunosuppressants seem to be working. It's not a cure, but it's buying us time." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief flooding through him. Margaret wasn't out of danger yet, but she had a fighting chance now, and that was more than he could have hoped for an hour ago. Emily looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with hope. "Does that mean she's going to be okay?" Jack knelt down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It means she's fighting," he said softly, "and that's a good sign. We just have to keep hoping." Emily nodded, her small hand slipping into his. Jack squeezed it gently, feeling the warmth of her trust. He had never imagined himself in this position, balancing the roles of doctor, father, and protector all at once. But in that moment, with Emily by his side and Margaret fighting for her life, Jack knew he would do whatever it took to make things right. But the battle wasn't over yet. As the nurses continued to monitor Margaret's progress, Jack's mind returned to the phone call, to the threat that loomed over everything. He had made his choice, but the consequences were still coming. Whoever was behind this, whether it was Mitchell or someone even higher up, they wouldn't back down easily. They had too much to lose. And now, so did Jack. He stood, his jaw set with determination. He wasn't just going to fight for Margaret's life. He was going to expose the truth. The people responsible for this, those who had covered up the dangers of Zenexa and let innocent people suffer, they weren't going to get away with it. Jack glanced down at Emily, her hopeful eyes looking back at him. For her, for Margaret, and for all the other victims, he would make sure of it. As the room settled into a quieter rhythm, the machine steady, Jack felt the next chapter of this battle unfolding before him. He had saved Margaret for now, but the real fight was just beginning. The hospital settled into a fragile quiet as the nurses moved around Margaret, keeping a close watch on the machines that hummed with their rhythmic, steady beeping. The immunosuppressants were working, buying Jack the precious time he needed, but he knew that this moment of calm wouldn't last. The battle for Margaret's life was far from over. Jack stood by her bed, watching her breathe. Her face had regained some color, but the shadows of her illness lingered just beneath the surface, reminding him that he couldn't afford to relax. Every decision, every choice from this moment forward, would determine whether she lived or died. Emily had fallen asleep on a small chair beside the bed, curled up under a blanket that one of the nurses had brought. Jack glanced over at her, his heart twisting with both love and guilt. How had he missed so much of her life? How had he let his ambitions blind him to what truly mattered? The regret was suffocating, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Margaret and Emily needed him to stay focused. But even as he forced himself to think like a doctor, the weight of his past decisions pressed down on him. The voice of Dr. Mitchell echoed in his mind, the cold warning still fresh. "You were part of this, Jack. You signed off on the protocols. If this comes out, it's not just me who goes down." Jack knew Mitchell was right. If the truth about Zenexa was revealed, it wouldn't just be the pharmaceutical company that paid the price. His own reputation would be destroyed. His name would be forever linked to a drug trial that had left people like Margaret on the verge of death. Years of hard work, dedication, and sacrifice would crumble in an instant. But Jack also knew that the alternative, doing nothing, keeping silent, was far worse. He couldn't live with himself knowing he had let this continue. He had to expose the truth, no matter the personal cost. His phone buzzed again, and this time, Jack hesitated before answering. He didn't want to hear more threats. didn't want another warning that he was walking into dangerous territory. But he knew he had to face it. Whatever came next, he would have to meet it head-on. The number was blocked. Jack took a deep breath and answered. "I see you haven't given up yet." The familiar voice of Dr. Mitchell greeted him, colder this time, devoid of the pretense of camaraderie. Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm not walking away, Stephen. You know I can't. Not after everything that's happened." Mitchell's chuckle was dark, hollow. "You always were the moral one, Jack. But I'm telling you, this isn't a fight you can win. You're in over your head. Do you really want to ruin your life over this?" "It's not just about my life," Jack snapped, his frustration boiling over. "It's about the lives you've destroyed. The people like Margaret who trusted us, who thought we were helping them. We were supposed to do no harm, Stephen." A pause hung on the line, as if Mitchell was considering his next move. When he spoke again, his voice was low and measured. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about Zenexa. There are bigger forces at play, Jack. If you go public with this, if you try to expose what happened, you'll be taking on people who won't hesitate to bury you. And I don't mean metaphorically." The threat landed like a punch to the gut, but Jack didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had known from the moment he decided to fight that he was stepping into dangerous territory. But there was no turning back. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not going to work," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "I don't care about the consequences anymore. Margaret deserves the truth. Emily deserves the truth. And I'm going to make sure they get it." Another pause, longer this time. Jack could hear the faint sound of Mitchell's breathing on the other end of the line, as if he were weighing his options. When he spoke again, there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "You're making a mistake, Jack. A big one. You think you can fight this, but you're alone. No one's going to back you up on this." "I'm not alone," Jack said, glancing at Margaret's pale figure lying in the hospital bed. "Not anymore." The line went dead. Jack lowered the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He had expected a fight, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Mitchell wasn't just trying to protect his own career. He was protecting something bigger, something that went beyond the drug trial. Jack was up against more than just one man. He was up against a system, a machine that would do anything to keep its secrets hidden. But no matter how powerful they were, Jack knew he couldn't let fear stop him. Margaret's life, and the lives of others who had been harmed by Zenexa, depended on him seeing this through. He turned back to Margaret, feeling a surge of determination course through him. Her chest rose and fell slowly, the steady beep of the heart monitor reassuring but fragile. She had fought so hard, and now it was his turn to fight for her. Jack pulled out his laptop and began to type furiously, searching for the information he needed. He still had access to some of the old research files from the Zenexa trial, documents that had been buried deep within the hospital's private archives. If he could find proof of the side effects, if he could trace the cover-up back to Mitchell and the pharmaceutical company, he would have enough to blow the lid off the entire operation. As the hours ticked by, Jack sifted through hundreds of files, his eyes scanning over page after page of data, memos, and internal communications. And then, finally, he found it. A series of emails exchanged between Mitchell and the higher-ups at the pharmaceutical company. The language was careful, but the implications were clear. They had known about the severe autoimmune reactions in certain patients. They had known, and they had buried the results to avoid a public scandal. Jack's heart pounded as he copied the files onto a secure drive. This was it, the proof he needed. With this, he could expose everything. But as the weight of his discovery settled in, so did the fear. He wasn't just taking on a pharmaceutical company. He was taking on an entire industry built on secrets and power. And Mitchell had been right about one thing. If Jack moved forward with this, there would be no going back. He closed his laptop, his mind racing. He had the evidence, but he needed to be smart about how he used it. Going public too soon could backfire, especially if the people involved tried to silence him before he had a chance to act. He needed to make sure that when the truth came out, it was undeniable and irreversible. Jack stood and walked over to Emily, who was still asleep in the chair beside Margaret's bed. He crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. He looked over at Margaret, her chest rising and falling with each slow breath. She was stable, but only just. The immunosuppressants had bought her time, but they hadn't cured her. And until he could figure out a way to fully reverse the effects of Zenexa, her life would remain in the balance. But for now, she was still here. And that was enough. Jack straightened, his resolve hardening. He had the proof. He had a plan. And he wasn't going to let fear or threats stop him from saving Margaret and bringing the truth to light. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence in the hospital room was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of machines and Margaret's slow, shallow breaths. Jack paced back and forth, his mind racing. The evidence was in his hands, proof that Mitchell and the pharmaceutical company had knowingly endangered lives for profit. The weight of it pressed down on him, but so did the realization of what came next. He had to move carefully. Mitchell's warning was clear. Powerful people were involved, and they wouldn't hesitate to protect themselves, no matter the cost. Jack couldn't risk a misstep, not when Margaret's life and the future of so many others were at stake. But the truth had to come out, and he had to be the one to deliver it. His phone buzzed on the table, and he froze. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was another threat, another attempt to scare him into silence. But when he glanced at the screen, he saw the name of an old colleague from his days in research journalism, Tom Gardner. Tom had been a fierce advocate for exposing corruption in the medical field, the kind of journalist who didn't back down, no matter how deep the cover-up went. Jack hesitated for only a second before answering. "Tom," Jack said quietly, his voice low, not wanting to wake Emily or disturb the fragile peace in the room. "Jack, I got your message," Tom replied, his tone sharp, full of urgency. "You sent me the files. This is big, bigger than I expected. I knew there were whispers about Zenexa, but this goes way beyond anything I've seen before." Jack swallowed, his grip tightening on the phone. "I don't know who to trust, Tom. There's more at play here than just the company. Mitchell's involved, and I'm starting to think there are other forces behind the scenes. If I go public with this, I need to know it'll stick." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Tom spoke again, his voice was steady. "You're doing the right thing, Jack. But you're right, this won't be easy. If you go forward with this, they're going to come after you. Hard. Are you ready for that?" Jack glanced over at Margaret, her frail form lying still in the hospital bed, and then at Emily, who was now stirring slightly in her chair, her small body shifting under the blanket. "I don't have a choice," Jack said quietly. "They've already taken enough from me. They've taken enough from Margaret. I can't let them get away with it." "All right," Tom replied, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll help you, but you need to make sure you're protected. There are legal channels we can use to ensure the documents are safeguarded before we go public. Once the story's out, they can't silence it, but we need to act fast." Jack's heart raced. He had spent his entire life avoiding risk, making the safest decisions, first for his career, and then, he thought, for his family. But this time, the safe choice wasn't an option. "How long do we have?" Jack asked, his mind already spinning with plans. "I'll have my team prepare everything. If you can get me a statement on record, we can start building the case. Once we're ready, we'll release the documents to the public all at once. News outlets, social media, everything. They won't be able to suppress it." A knot tightened in Jack's stomach. The consequences of this were enormous, and the thought of what might happen next sent a chill down his spine. But there was no turning back now. "I'll do it," Jack said. "Get everything ready. I'll give my statement and hand over all the files." Tom agreed, and after the call ended, Jack stood by the window, staring out into the cold, dark night. The weight of what he was about to do settled on his shoulders like a leaden burden. There was a time when he had been driven by ambition, by the need to succeed at all costs. But now, he realized the true cost of his decisions, and it wasn't something he could walk away from anymore. Jack turned back to Margaret, her breathing steady but still fragile. He moved to her bedside, gently taking her hand in his. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open for the briefest of moments. Her eyes were filled with exhaustion, but there was a spark of recognition as she looked at him. "Jack?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to pull him closer. "I'm here," Jack said softly, leaning in. I'm not going anywhere. Margaret's lips trembled as she struggled to speak, her voice weak but insistent. Emily, take care of her. Jack's heart clenched at her words. He had been fighting for so long, desperate to save her. But now, in this moment, Margaret was worried about their daughter, who had spent years without her father, without knowing who he was. I will, Jack promised, his throat tight. I'll take care of her. I won't let anything happen to her. I swear. Margaret's hand gripped his weakly, and Jack could see the exhaustion overtaking her again, her eyes beginning to close as sleep pulled her back under. He sat beside her, watching her drift off, feeling the weight of his own guilt press down harder. She had been forced to fight this battle alone for so long, and he hadn't been there when she needed him most. But now, he was here, and he wouldn't leave again. As the hours passed and the night deepened, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, everything would change. He had already made enemies by choosing to fight back, but the real battle was only just beginning. Suddenly, the door to the hospital room creaked open, and Jack's head snapped up. A nurse entered, her expression tight with concern. She approached Jack cautiously, her voice low as she spoke. Dr. Lawson, there's someone here to see you, she said, her eyes darting toward the hallway. He says it's urgent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. His mind immediately went to Mitchell's warning about the people who would come after him if he didn't back down. His pulse quickened, and he instinctively moved closer to Margaret and Emily, shielding them from whatever was coming. Who is it? Jack asked, his voice tense. The nurse hesitated. He wouldn't give his name, but he said, it's about the files. Jack's blood ran cold. He stood, his mind racing, knowing that whoever was here was likely connected to the conspiracy he had uncovered. His instinct told him to protect his family, to push back against whatever threat was coming his way. But he couldn't do that from the shadows anymore. Stay with them, Jack instructed the nurse, his voice low but firm as he glanced at Margaret and Emily. I'll be back. The nurse nodded, her face pale with understanding, as Jack made his way down the sterile hallway toward the hospital entrance. His heart pounded with each step, the fear and uncertainty swirling inside him like a storm. But there was something else there too, something stronger. Determination. Whoever was waiting for him, whatever threat lay ahead, Jack knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As he turned the corner and approached the figure standing in the shadows, Jack braced himself for the confrontation. The battle for the truth was about to begin. The sterile light of the hospital hallway flickered as Jack walked toward the figure waiting in the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, his muscles tense, ready for whatever confrontation lay ahead. He could feel the weight of the evidence in his mind. The files, the emails, everything that tied Mitchell and the pharmaceutical company to Margaret's suffering. But now, it seemed, someone else had come to confront him, to warn him off or worse. As Jack approached, the figure stepped forward, revealing a man in a dark suit, his features sharp and eyes cold. Jack didn't recognize him, but there was no mistaking the man's purpose. He was sent to deliver a message, just like the calls before. Jack braced himself, determined not to show any fear. Dr. Lawson, the man said, his voice smooth but dripping with menace. I believe you've been warned already. This doesn't have to go any further. Jack stared at him, anger simmering just beneath the surface. It's too late for that, he replied, his voice steady. I've seen the files. I know what Zenexa has done, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else cover this up any longer. The man's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. You're making a dangerous choice, Dr. Lawson. People who push too hard often find themselves in situations they can't control. We wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to you or your family. Jack's jaw tightened. The threat was blatant, and it sent a spike of fear through him, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He had already put everything on the line. He thought of Margaret, of Emily, of the years they had lost because of his own selfish choices. This was his chance to make it right, to protect them the way he should have from the beginning. You can't intimidate me, Jack said, his voice cold. I've already sent the files to someone I trust. If anything happens to me, if you even think about hurting my family, the truth will come out. And there won't be anything you can do to stop it." For a moment, the man's mask slipped, and Jack saw a flicker of anger flash across his face. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that cold, calculated look once more. "You're playing a dangerous game, Doctor," the man said, his tone quieter now, almost a whisper. "But I'll give you one last chance. Walk away. Forget about the files. You can still protect what you've built, your career, your life. If you continue down this path, there's no going back." Jack's heart raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. He knew the man was right about one thing. If he exposed the truth, there would be no turning back. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for would be torn apart. The medical world would never see him the same way again. But Jack knew that the man standing before him wasn't offering him salvation. He was offering silence. Silence at the cost of Margaret's life, at the cost of countless others. "I've made my choice," Jack said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "The truth is coming out. You can't stop it." The man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the tiled floor until they faded into the distance. Jack stood there for a moment, his heart still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. Now, all he could do was wait for Tom to take the next steps. When Jack returned to Margaret's room, the nurse gave him a reassuring nod. Margaret's condition was stable for now, but Jack could see the strain on her body. Emily had woken up and was sitting by her mother's side, holding Margaret's hand, her wide eyes filled with worry and hope. "Everything all right?" the nurse asked quietly, sensing the tension in Jack's expression. Jack forced a smile, trying to ease the knot of anxiety that had taken root in his chest. "Yeah," he said softly, "everything's fine." But nothing was fine. Not yet. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jack moved to the chair beside Emily and sat down, reaching out to take her small hand in his. She looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes, and he felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He had spent so many years away, lost in his career, forgetting what truly mattered. But now, sitting here, holding his daughter's hand, Jack knew he couldn't afford to lose her. He couldn't afford to lose either of them. Margaret stirred in the bed, her eyes fluttering open. Jack leaned in closer, his heart aching at the sight of her so fragile, so close to the edge. "Jack," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "I'm here," Jack said softly, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm right here." Margaret's eyes met his, filled with pain and exhaustion, but also with something else, something softer, more forgiving. "I didn't think you'd come back," she whispered, her words slurring slightly from the medication. Jack's throat tightened, guilt surging through him once again. "I should have been there," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I should have been there for you and Emily." She shook her head slightly, her lips curling into a faint, tired smile. "You're here now," she whispered. "That's what matters." Jack felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. He wasn't going to lose her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I'm going to fix this," Jack promised, his voice fierce with determination. "I'm going to make sure you get the care you need. And I'm going to make sure the people who did this pay for what they've done." Margaret's eyes softened, and she nodded weakly, trusting him in a way that made Jack's heart ache even more. The door to the room opened, and the attending physician stepped in, his face serious but not grim. "Dr. Lawson, I've reviewed the latest tests. The immunosuppressants are helping, but we need to be careful. Margaret's condition is still critical. We're not out of the woods yet." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He had expected this. The immunosuppressants were only a temporary solution. Margaret's body had been ravaged by the effects of Zenexa, and unless they could reverse the damage, her organs would continue to fail. "Do whatever you have to," Jack said firmly. "Just keep her stable. I'm working on a more permanent solution." The doctor gave a curt nod and left the room, leaving Jack to sit in the heavy silence once again. He could feel the weight of the files in his mind, the evidence that would soon be unleashed on the world. But for now, all he could do was wait, and hope that when the storm hit, it would bring justice with it. As the hours passed, Jack remained by Margaret's side, his hand resting on hers, his mind running through every possible outcome. He had made his choice. He had chosen truth over safety, justice over silence. But the cost of that choice was still unknown. Emily had fallen asleep again, curled up in the chair beside Margaret, and Jack sat in the quiet, listening to the soft sound of their breathing. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, even if it was fleeting. He had done the right thing. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the world to catch up. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.